Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and today I am doing a video that I haven't done in a while, an I Stand Alone video. If you haven't seen me do one of these, I take a single issue of a comic book, and I read it without reading anything that came before or after, and I determine if it stands alone in terms of does it work for a new reader. And sometimes that can mean I've been reading comics for a long time, but I've maybe never read anything concerning this character or this team before, so in theory I am a new reader for that particular grouping of characters. Or you might be a brand spanking new reader, in which case things are even more scary. Because if I'm a gigantic fan of Batman and then I sample an issue of Hawkman and I decide that it doesn't make any sense, DC Comics hasn't really lost anything because I'm still a gigantic fan of Batman. But if you take Joe Schmo down the street who has never ever read a comic book before and then he reads an issue of Hawkman and it doesn't make sense, well then they've maybe lost a reader for life because the writer didn't really work as hard as they could have to make that issue make perfect sense for a brand new reader. And so that's the purpose of this series of videos. Today I'm going to be talking about Martian Manhunter issue 3 from 1988, written by J.M. DeMatteis, drawn by Mark Badger. I believe Mark Badger drew it. DeMatteis is pretty huge. He did a lot of stuff around this time. He worked with Keith Giffen on the Justice League International title, the one that is really well known for being a funny Justice League. He was part of that. He did the Dr. Fate relaunch around the same time period, the one with the stepson and stepmother who merged to become Dr. Fate, and they had a comic relief dog that was actually a demon. I read about 30 or so issues of that series. Anyway, I really like J.M. DeMatteis as a writer. He can do serious, contemplative stuff, and he can also do the funny stuff, particularly with Keith Giffen, because he did that Justice League stuff in the late 80s, early 90s, and then he kind of did a return, if you will, to that team with a few new characters thrown in the mid-2000s. He actually did 2 returns to that, and then he also did the Planetary Brigade, I believe is what it was called, again with Keith Giffen, if I'm not mistaken. And so he's really good at doing the funny and also doing the serious, and this issue is definitely along the lines of the serious. However, I'm not here to review the issue itself. I'm here to decide, does it stand alone? Basically, I'm going to come down with not really. The whole thing is more or less a retcon / recap of John Jones's origin as the Martian Manhunter. Chances are, even if you are a huge fan of DC Comics, you may not know the Martian Manhunter's origin story because the Martian Manhunter is one of those characters who you don't see in his own solo title that often. In fact, more often than not, I would say about 99% of the time, he's more well known as being a member of the Justice League. So the fact that he had solo stories before being a member of the Justice League is a fact that most people just usually don't know, or if they do know it, they usually don't care. Before this comic book, the Martian Manhunter's origin was that he lived on Mars, and then this scientist called Dr. Erdell had built a machine on Earth, and he accidentally teleported the Martian Manhunter to Earth, and then the appearance of this giant green alien kind of gave him a heart attack, and so he died. And then the Martian Manhunter took the name John Jones, which the scientist had said when he heard John Jones's real name, and that's what he thought that the name was. So then he became a detective who was actually in the form of a human being, and then he was also the Martian Manhunter as a superhero. And that was basically his status quo before becoming a member of the Justice League, and then that status quo was kind of dropped and he was just a member of the Justice League. This comic book basically takes all of that and throws it in the trash. I personally am not going to say that this comic book is bad because it throws all of that in the trash. I think you can look at any time something like this is done and you can say it works on a case-by-case basis. In this case, I don't really know. On the one hand, someone reading this from 1988 probably wouldn't know the Martian Manhunter's origin from the 1950s. Heck, if someone found this in a back issue bin now, they probably wouldn't know the Martian Manhunter's origin from the 1950s. The problem is, this comic book draws so much attention to the fact that it is erasing everything that you once knew about the Martian Manhunter and saying, this is what really happened. Now granted, at the time this was pretty popular at DC Comics. Comics. You had the Man of Steel miniseries by John Byrne, which completely reinvented Superman. You had Batman Year One, which was by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. And while that didn't really reinvent Batman as the Superman, Man of Steel, or George Perez's Wonder Woman stuff did, it definitely stripped down a lot of the useless stuff that had accumulated in the Batman stories over the years. So this sort of thing is not exactly unknown at the time. The problem is, I don't really think that the Martian Manhunter's origin story needed to be redefined for a new generation. The Martian Manhunter is a character whose origin doesn't really matter. It's the kind of origin where you do it just to get to the point where you can tell stories. Stories such as Martian detective who is now stranded on Earth. He's the last of his kind, and he solves mysteries and fights crime with the Justice League. That is the kind of stories that you need to tell. You do not need to tell a story about how the human scientist who actually died actually made John Jones think that he was dead just so that John Jones could get on with his new life because his old life was so painful for him to remember. All of that is sort of overly complicated in my humble. Now, it would be fine if this comic book just retconned everything and started with a new origin story and then went forward with new stories, but it doesn't do that. This is the third issue in what I'm assuming is at least a 4-issue miniseries, since it does have a to be continued thing at the end, and in issue 3, we are dealing with retconning like 99% of the Martian Manhunter's origin stuff. We have the fact that he's not really weak to fire and that was just a mental block or a lie told to him when he was younger. We have the fact that he's basically had amnesia the entire time that he's on Earth, and then there's the aforementioned fact that the scientist who found him is not really dead. And all of that, I don't really think that we needed an update on his origin story because of the fact that nobody actually remembered his origin story. And you might be saying, but if nobody remembered, then what does it matter that they reinvented his origin story in 1988? Well, the problem is that this calls back to the origin story from the 50s so much. In fact, if I was a reader in 1988 and I read this, I would kind of want to see what the old origin story was just to see what all the fuss was about here. Now, I feel like I've talked a whole lot about the premise here without actually talking about if this is a good issue for new readers to jump on. I'm going to say, no, not really. The first half of this issue is basically stream of consciousness. Martian Manhunter has all of these thoughts in his head. He's got contradicting thoughts about what Mars is, his real thoughts that are much grittier than the 1950s pulpy thoughts that he has in his head. We find out later that the scientist who found him, he was a huge fan of the pulp stories from the 1930s and Edgar Rice Burroughs novels and stuff like that. So when he was trying to help Jean forget his painful past, he was basically imprinting this goofy 1950s ideal of Mars in his head. So basically all of the stuff that we knew about Mars before this comic book was a lie, and they tried to find a clever way of making us believe that, okay, none of that stuff actually matters. And like I say, if you are a brand new reader, this is probably not going to make any sense. If you didn't know anything about the Martian Manhunter, you would definitely be confused, because about half of this comic deals with him trying to figure out just what exactly is going on. And if you are a new reader, you are also going to be trying to figure out just what exactly is going on. Heck, I feel like I know a decent amount about DC Comics, and even I wasn't sure what was going on for the first half of this book. Now, it's all explained in the second half, but at that point, I was basically just kind of angry at the fact that this comic book was made. And I was sitting there thinking about why this thing was made. And I'll be honest, I still haven't really come to a decision on why it was made. Now, if I'm being honest, this comic book is not that bad. It's not really great in premise. I don't like the idea of let's take everything that we know about the Martian Manhunter and say that all of that is a lie, and let's do a grim and gritty version of the Martian Manhunter. I don't think that this is an origin story that needed to be redone for the 1980s. I really don't think that we needed a grim and gritty take on the Martian Manhunter, especially since, as near as I can tell, nothing really changed after this miniseries. In fact, I do remember reading an early 2000s, late 90s Martian Manhunter comic book, and I may talk about it someday, probably not, and basically it restores everything that this thing tries to get rid of from the pre-1980 1988 Martian Manhunter history. So at the end of the day, you're kind of left sitting there saying, why? Why did this thing even happen? And honestly, I don't know. Like I said, I really like J.M. DeMatteis as a writer. I just feel like maybe this was not exactly a hit in his career. One other cool thing that I thought was interesting, and is probably the one thing that I miss about reading single issues, specifically single issues that are way before my time, is seeing some of the advertisements for comic books that were coming out around this time. Some of this stuff is things I've never heard of before, like The World of Metropolis. That is got John Byrne in there. That art is very clearly John Byrne. I had never heard of this thing before. I googled it and I didn't see that it was collected anywhere. If it was in a volume that is like other stuff other than this miniseries, but I for one would really like to see a miniseries about the cast of Superman minus Superman doing Daily Planet stuff. And I'm going to keep my eye out and see if that thing is collected somewhere, and if it is, you are mine. And then we have stuff that lots of people have probably heard of. You may have heard of The Killing Joke. It's really strange to me that this iconic storyline that has existed since before I was born was once upon a time being advertised, and someone out there was seeing this for the first time and they did not have any idea what was in store for them. And then on a less optimistic note, you have something like Batman the Cult, which was in its own way trying to recapture the fire of The Dark Knight Returns, but it was Jim Starlin, and you don't know this about me, but I really hate Jim Starlin's work on Batman, so naturally it wasn't that good. So, I'm digressing. I probably need to end this video kind of soon. In summary, I would say this is not the best comic book for a new reader to start in on. This is probably not even the best comic book for an old reader to start in on, because they're going to have even more questions than a new reader would have. So overall, I would say, no, this does not pass the test. I hope that this video was not too rambly for you. I tend to do that whenever I'm talking about something like this. And if it was not too rambly, then I congratulate you, sir or madam, and I would ask you to give this video a like, and also to share it, subscribe to my channel, and comment in this video if you have anything nice or maybe constructively critical to say. In the meantime, I will see you guys tomorrow for some other kind of video. So until then, be safe and have a great day. Catch you then.